The judge looked down from the bench and adjusted his glasses. Then he said 5 words that changed everything. "Good morning, Colonel Bennett." The courtroom went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that lasts a second or two. The kind that makes people stop breathing. Across the room, Eleanor Whitmore's confident smile disappeared. Just moments earlier, she had been sitting proudly beside a team of expensive attorneys, convinced she already knew how this case would end. Now she looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under her. I remained still. My hands rested calmly on the table in front of me. I had learned long ago that panic never solves a problem. The judge opened a file and glanced toward Eleanor's legal team. "I trust everyone has reviewed Mrs. Bennett's background." The attorneys exchanged nervous looks. One finally cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we were not fully aware." The judge raised an eyebrow. That would be an understatement. A ripple moved through the gallery behind us. People began whispering. For months, Eleanor had told anyone who would listen that I was a helpless widow trying to hold on to property that belonged to her family. She said I was emotional. She said I was confused. She said I had manipulated my late husband into leaving our lake house to me. Today those stories were beginning to fall apart. My daughter Emily sat in the front row. The expression on her face said everything. Even she was realizing there were parts of my life I had never talked about. The truth was simple. I had never hidden who I was. People had simply decided not to ask. The judge continued reviewing documents while Eleanor stared at me in disbelief. For the first time since this nightmare began, she looked uncertain. 3 months earlier, she had mailed a lawsuit that she believed would force me into surrender. She thought money would win. She thought pressure would win. Most of all, she thought I would be too weak to fight back. She was wrong. And before this hearing was over, everyone in that courtroom was about to learn exactly how wrong she had been. Before the lawsuit, before the courtroom, before Eleanor Whitmore turned grief into a legal battle, there was Michael, my husband, my best friend, the man who made every place feel like home. For 31 years, we built a life together that was far from perfect, but filled with love. We raised our daughter Emily in a small town outside Atlanta. We worked hard. We paid our bills. We celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary weekends that seemed unremarkable at the time, but later became priceless memories. Our favorite place was a cedar cabin on Lake Blue Ridge. It was not a mansion. It was not worth millions, but it was ours. Michael bought the property years before retirement, dreaming of a place where we could slow down and enjoy life. Every summer, we spent countless evenings on the porch, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. Emily learned to fish from the dock. Family photos covered the walls. Every room held a story. Then came the diagnosis. Cancer. The word arrived like a storm that neither of us saw coming. At first, Michael tried to stay positive. He joked with nurses. He reassured Emily. He insisted everything would be fine. But as the months passed, reality became impossible to ignore. The treatments drained his strength. Simple tasks became difficult. Some days he barely had enough energy to walk across a room. Yet whenever he felt well enough, he wanted to go to the cabin. Something about that place brought him peace. He would sit on the dock wrapped in a blanket while I sat nearby with a book. Sometimes we talked for hours. Sometimes we said nothing at all. Those quiet moments became more valuable than anything money could buy. When Michael passed away, the silence that followed felt unbearable. The house seemed too large. The days felt too long. Even ordinary routines reminded me of what I had lost. Emily worried about me constantly. She called every day. She visited whenever she could. Like many daughters who love their mothers, she wanted to fix the pain. But grief is not something another person can repair. It is something you learn to carry. For a few months, I focused on healing. I believed our family would do the same. I believed everyone was mourning the same man. What I did not understand was that while I was trying to rebuild my life, someone else was already preparing for a fight. Behind polite phone calls and expressions of sympathy, resentment was quietly growing. And before long, that resentment would arrive at my doorstep in the form of a certified letter that changed everything. The certified letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. I remember the weather because it matched my mood. Gray skies hung over the neighborhood as I stood in my kitchen making coffee. The house was quiet. Emily was at work. The television was off. For the first time in days, I had planned to spend the afternoon organizing old photographs from our trips to the lake. Instead, a knock at the door changed everything. The delivery driver handed me an envelope and asked for a signature. The moment I saw the law firm's name printed across the front, a knot formed in my stomach. I opened it at the kitchen table. Page after page detailed allegations that felt both shocking and deeply insulting. Eleanor Whitmore was challenging Michael's final wishes. According to the petition, I had supposedly manipulated my husband during his illness. The filing claimed Michael was vulnerable. It suggested I had influenced decisions regarding the lake cabin. Most painful of all, it implied that our marriage had been built on deception rather than love. I read every page twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, because I could not believe it. After everything Michael had endured, after everything our family had experienced, this was what remained. A fight over property. That evening, Emily came over for dinner. I showed her the documents. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "This is unbelievable," she said. I nodded. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she sat across from me and sighed. "Mom, maybe you should consider settling." I looked up. Settling? She hesitated. "Grandma Eleanor has money. She has attorneys. She will keep this going for months if she wants to." I knew she was speaking from concern, not criticism. Emily hated conflict. She wanted peace. She wanted her family to stop hurting each other. But some situations cannot be solved by surrendering. I folded the papers carefully. "Your father made his wishes clear," I said. "I know," she replied. "Then why would I walk away from them?" Emily looked down at the table. She did not have an answer. A few days later, my phone rang. The caller was Eleanor. Her voice sounded sweet and friendly. Almost too friendly. She invited me to a family dinner the following Sunday. She claimed everyone wanted to reconnect, to heal, to move forward together. Something in her tone made me suspicious. Still, I accepted. Part of me hoped we could settle this as adults. Part of me still believed grief was the reason people were behaving badly. I had not yet realized that the dinner invitation was never about reconciliation. It was about intimidation. And Eleanor planned to make that very clear the moment I walked through her front door. Eleanor Whitmore's house sat along the river on one of the most expensive streets in the county. The property looked exactly like the image she worked so hard to maintain. Perfect. The lawn was trimmed with military precision. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Crystal chandeliers glowed through oversized windows. From the outside, it looked like the home of a family that had everything. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt very different. The moment I walked through the door, I sensed that I was not there as a guest. I was there as a target. Several relatives had already arrived. Most greeted me politely. A few barely acknowledged me. Michael's younger brother, Brandon Whitmore, stood near the fireplace, nursing a drink. He offered a brief nod before looking away. Emily had chosen not to attend. Looking back, that was probably the smartest decision anyone made that evening. Dinner began with small talk. Weather, sports, local news. The kind of harmless conversation families use when they are avoiding the real issue. Eventually, Eleanor placed her napkin on the table and smiled. The room immediately grew quieter. Everyone knew what was coming. "Legal matters can become very expensive," she said, "especially for someone facing experienced attorneys." I took a sip of water. "Is that so?" Her smile widened. "I am simply concerned about you. The stress must be overwhelming." I said nothing. Eleanor leaned back comfortably. "You should have accepted our offer weeks ago." Brandon finally spoke. "Dad always wanted the cabin to stay with the family." I looked directly at him. Michael was family. Nobody answered. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Eleanor dabbed her lips with a napkin. "That is what you claim. What Michael documented says something entirely different." The confidence in her voice caught my attention. She genuinely believed she had already won. Or perhaps she wanted everyone else to believe it. Then came the comment that revealed exactly how she viewed me. "You always thought you knew everything, Caroline." I raised an eyebrow. "Did I?" She nodded. "You spent your life acting independent. But in the end, you were just a wife." Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even Brandon looked away. The words hung in the air, not because they hurt, but because they revealed far more about Eleanor than they did about me. For a moment, I simply studied her. This was not grief speaking. This was pride. This was a woman who could not accept losing control. I placed my fork beside my plate. Then I stood. "If that is all," I said calmly, "I will see you in court." A soft laugh escaped her lips. "Court?" She shook her head. "Caroline, you're finished." I smiled politely. Then I walked out. The drive home was quiet. Dark clouds covered the sky. Streetlights flashed past the windshield one after another. When I finally arrived home, I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. Instead, I walked upstairs to the back of my closet. Hidden behind several storage boxes sat a locked case that had not been opened in years. I carried it downstairs and placed it on the dining room table. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I unlocked it. Inside rested documents, medals, photographs, and pieces of a life most people around me had never seen. A life Eleanor Whitmore knew absolutely nothing about. And before long, that mistake was going to cost her dearly. The case opened with a quiet click. For years it had remained untouched in the back of my closet. Not because I was ashamed of what it contained. Quite the opposite. I simply no longer needed those reminders. That chapter of my life had already served its purpose. Yet now, sitting alone at my dining room table, I carefully lifted the lid and looked inside. The first item was an old photograph. I was standing beside a group of officers, nearly 3 decades younger, wearing a neatly pressed uniform and smiling at the camera. Beneath it sat folders filled with evaluations, commendations, and legal records. There were challenge coins from commanders I had worked with, certificates from training programs completed long ago, letters of appreciation from people whose names most civilians would never recognize. At the very bottom rested the insignia I had not touched in years. I picked it up and turned it slowly in my hand. Memories returned immediately. Long days, long nights, difficult decisions, years spent serving in the United States Army. Most people assumed military service was only about soldiers carrying equipment or working overseas. My path had been different. I spent more than 20 years handling legal matters within the military justice system. I investigated misconduct. I reviewed evidence. I questioned witnesses. I prepared cases where facts mattered more than assumptions. The work taught me something valuable. Confidence is not about speaking loudly. Confidence comes from preparation. The reason I never bragged about that career was simple. Michael never cared about titles. When we married, he loved the person behind the rank. As the years passed, we built a life centered on family rather than accomplishments. Once retirement arrived, I was happy to leave the spotlight behind. The neighbors knew me as Caroline, the woman who baked pies for charity events, the wife who spent weekends at the lake, the mother who attended every school concert. Very few people knew anything else. Certainly not Eleanor. To her, I was simply a widow, a vulnerable woman she believed could be pressured into surrender. The thought almost made me laugh. I spent the next several hours reviewing every document connected to Michael's estate. Every signature, every date, every communication. By midnight, the dining room table was covered with neatly organized files. The facts were stronger than I remembered. Michael had documented everything carefully. He anticipated potential disputes. He wanted his wishes respected. As I worked, a strange feeling settled over me. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. For months, grief had clouded my judgment. I had been focused on surviving each day. Now I remembered something important. I was still the same woman I had always been. Loss had changed my circumstances. It had not changed my character. The following morning, I organized the final binder and placed it beside the door.
Court was approaching.
Eleanor would arrive with expensive attorneys and endless confidence. I would arrive alone. At least that was what everyone believed. In reality, I was bringing something far more powerful: the truth. And unlike money, the truth never needed a legal team to stand on its own. The morning of the hearing arrived cold and gray. A thin layer of fog drifted across the city as I parked outside the county courthouse. For a moment, I sat quietly behind the wheel. Not because I was nervous, because I was thinking about Michael. He would have hated this entire situation. He believed family disagreements should be handled with honesty and respect. Instead, we were about to fight in a courtroom. I took a deep breath, gathered my documents, and stepped outside. Emily was waiting near the entrance. She handed me a cup of coffee and studied my face carefully. "Mom," she said softly, "are you sure about this?" I smiled. "Absolutely." She looked toward the courthouse doors. "Grandma Eleanor brought 3 attorneys." "I know. You are really going in there alone?" I placed a hand on her shoulder.
"No, sweetheart.
I am going in there prepared." A few minutes later, we entered the building. The hallway outside the courtroom was already crowded. Attorneys moved between conference rooms carrying thick files. Families sat nervously on wooden benches. Court staff hurried from one office to another. Then I saw Eleanor. She stood near the entrance, wearing an expensive cream-colored suit. A pearl necklace rested neatly around her neck. 3 attorneys surrounded her. The group looked confident, almost relaxed. When Eleanor noticed me, a familiar smile appeared. The same smile she wore at family dinner. The smile of someone who believed victory was guaranteed. "Well, look who showed up," she said. One of the attorneys glanced behind me. His eyes searched the hallway, apparently looking for my legal representation. When he found nobody, his expression shifted slightly. Eleanor noticed it too. "You came by yourself," she said. I simply nodded. Her smile widened. "Interesting choice." Without another word, I walked past them and entered the courtroom. Emily followed closely behind. We took our seats. The minutes crawled by. Conversations filled the room. Papers shuffled.
Chairs moved.
Then, exactly at 9 o'clock, the courtroom doors closed. Everyone stood as the judge entered. Judge Robert Hensley settled into his chair and began reviewing the case file. The room became silent. For several moments, he said nothing. He simply turned pages. Then his eyes lifted toward me. "Good morning, Colonel Bennett." The effect was immediate. Every conversation stopped. Every movement froze. I heard someone drop a pen behind me. Across the room, Eleanor's confident smile vanished. One attorney blinked several times as though he had misheard the judge. Emily slowly turned toward me. Her eyes widened.
"Colonel?"
The judge continued reading. "Retired Colonel Caroline Bennett, 23 years of service. Former military legal officer. Specialized in military justice, investigations, and complex litigation matters." The silence became almost uncomfortable. One of Eleanor's attorneys finally cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we were not aware of that background." Judge Hensley looked over his glasses. "That observation may qualify as the understatement of the year." A few quiet laughs echoed through the gallery. The attorney immediately sat down. Eleanor stared at me, not with anger, with disbelief. The woman she had dismissed as weak, the widow she assumed would surrender, the person she repeatedly described as helpless, suddenly looked very different. Judge Hensley closed the file. "Mrs. Bennett, are you representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well." The judge nodded. "Then let us proceed." For the first time that morning, I noticed uncertainty spreading across the other side of the room. Their confidence was gone. In its place was something else. Concern. Because they were finally beginning to understand what Eleanor never bothered to learn. They had not brought a widow into court. They had brought a highly trained legal professional into a battle built entirely on assumptions. And the hearing had only just begun. Once the hearing officially began, Eleanor's attorneys moved first. Their presentations sounded polished. They spoke confidently about concerns regarding Michael's final decisions. They suggested that illness had left him vulnerable. They implied that I had influenced him during a period when he was unable to think clearly. To someone hearing the case for the first time, the argument might have sounded convincing. The problem was that convincing stories are not the same as evidence. When their presentation ended, Judge Hensley turned toward me. "Mrs. Bennet, your response?" I stood and approached the podium. The courtroom became quiet again. Not because I raised my voice. Because I did not. Years of legal work had taught me that calm questions often reveal more than emotional speeches. I opened my binder. Then I began. "Counselor, did your firm interview Michael Bennett's primary oncologist?" The attorney hesitated.
No.
I nodded. "Did you interview any of the hospice nurses who cared for him during his final months?"
No.
"Did you obtain written statements from those medical professionals regarding his mental capacity?"
No.
A few people shifted in their seats. The attorney's confidence was beginning to fade. I continued. "Did your team review visitation records from the hospice center?"
No.
"Did you interview neighbors, friends, or family members who regularly interacted with Michael during the period in question?"
No.
Each answer landed harder than the one before.
Not because I was attacking him.
Because the truth was becoming obvious. The investigation supporting their claims was incomplete. Judge Hensley leaned forward slightly. I could tell he was paying close attention. I turned another page. "So your allegation that Michael was incapable of making independent decisions is based primarily on assumptions rather than direct testimony from the medical professionals responsible for his care." The attorney shifted uncomfortably.
I would not characterize it that way.
I smiled politely. "Of course not." Several people in the gallery exchanged glances. Then I introduced the document that changed everything. "Your Honor, I would like to submit Exhibit D." The court clerk accepted the folder and delivered copies to the judge and opposing counsel. Judge Hensley reviewed the first page carefully. The room grew still. The document was a signed estate letter written by Michael 8 months before his death. In clear language, he explained his wishes regarding the lake cabin. He stated that the property belonged solely to me. He confirmed he was acting voluntarily. Most importantly, he specifically addressed the possibility of future challenges. The letter stated that any attempt to overturn his decision would be directly against his wishes. The judge continued reading. Across the room, Eleanor's face slowly lost color. "That cannot be real," she said suddenly. The courtroom turned toward her. Judge Hensley looked over his glasses. "Mrs. Whitmore, you will wait your turn." Eleanor immediately fell silent. I remained standing. Then I spoke the words that changed the atmosphere completely. "It is not impossible. It is simply inconvenient." For the first time since filing the lawsuit, Eleanor looked genuinely worried. And unfortunately for her, Exhibit D was only the beginning. The courtroom remained tense after Exhibit D was entered into evidence. Eleanor's attorneys spent several minutes reviewing the document. Their earlier confidence had disappeared. They whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing toward their client. None of them looked comfortable. Judge Hensley eventually turned toward me. "Mrs. Bennet, do you have anything further?" I did. In fact, I had been waiting for this moment. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce one final piece of evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." I opened another folder and handed a flash drive to the court clerk. The attorneys on the opposite side immediately looked
Concerned.
Judge Hensley examined the accompanying paperwork. "Recorded telephone conversations?" "Yes, Your Honor." The recordings had been legally preserved years earlier as part of Michael's estate documentation. The foundation for their admission was quickly established. Moments later, the audio began playing through the courtroom speakers. Static crackled briefly. Then a familiar voice filled the room. "Eleanor." The recording was not dramatic. That was what made it powerful. It sounded like an ordinary conversation between a mother and her son. But the words carried weight. "Michael, if Caroline truly cared about this family, she would return the cabin." A pause followed. Then Michael responded. His voice was weaker than I remembered. The illness had already taken much of his strength. "Mom, we have discussed this. The property belongs to Caroline." Another pause. "You are not thinking clearly," Eleanor replied. "You are sick. You are emotional. You should reconsider." Several people in the gallery exchanged looks. The recording continued. Then came the moment that mattered most. Michael spoke slowly, but firmly. "Mom, stop. This is my decision, not yours." The room became completely silent.
No arguments. No explanations. No interpretations.
Just Michael's own words. The evidence said more than any attorney could. When the recording ended, nobody spoke for several seconds. Judge Hensley reviewed his notes. Eleanor stared at the table in front of her. For the first time since this case began, she looked defeated. Her attorneys knew it too. The central argument of their lawsuit had collapsed. Michael had clearly expressed his wishes. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. The judge finally closed the file. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett. I believe the court has heard enough." A wave of anticipation moved through the room. Everyone understood what came next. Months of accusations. Months of legal threats. Months of family conflict. All of it now rested on a single decision. The evidence had been presented. The arguments were finished. Now the entire courtroom waited for Judge Hensley to announce the ruling that would determine the future of the lake cabin and finally bring this painful chapter to an end. The ruling came later that afternoon. By then, everyone in the courtroom understood where the case was headed. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud carried a different weight. Judge Hensley reviewed his notes one final time. Then he delivered the decision. The petition is denied. The lake cabin shall remain the sole property of Caroline Bennett in accordance with Michael Bennett's documented wishes. Just like that, it was over. Months of accusations disappeared in a matter of seconds. A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. I closed my binder and released a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Beside me, Emily smiled through tears. When we stepped outside the courthouse, she wrapped her arms around me. "Mom," she said, "I cannot believe you never told me all of that." I laughed softly. "There was never a reason to." She shook her head. "You spent years handling legal cases and never mentioned it." I looked toward the courthouse doors. "Your father always said the most important things about a person are usually the things they do not need to advertise." A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Eleanor called. This time there were no attorneys.
No threats. No demands.
She asked if we could meet for coffee. Curiosity got the better of me, so I agreed. We met at a small diner halfway between our homes. When she arrived, she looked different. Older somehow.
Smaller.
Without the courtroom and the lawyers around her, she seemed less intimidating and more human. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Eleanor finally looked down at her coffee cup. "I was angry," she admitted. "Angrier than I realized. Not at you. At losing him." For the first time in a very long while, there was no hostility in her voice. Only sadness. And that changed everything. A few days after meeting Eleanor, I returned to the lake cabin. The drive felt different this time. Lighter. The legal battle was over. The anger was gone. For the first time in months, the future felt peaceful again. The cabin looked exactly as Michael had loved it. The cedar siding glowed beneath the afternoon sun. The water stretched quietly across the lake. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I spent the next few days working around the property. I repaired a loose section of railing near the dock. I painted a few weathered shutters. I cleaned out an old storage shed that Michael always planned to organize someday. The work was simple, but healing often begins with simple things. One evening, I sat alone on the porch as the sun disappeared beyond the water. The same view Michael and I had shared countless times. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Not in sadness. In gratitude. The cabin remained exactly where he wanted it. His wishes had been honored. And more importantly, his memory had been protected. As darkness settled across the lake, I realized something important. The greatest victory was never winning the case. The greatest victory was refusing to let bitterness become my future. Life has a way of revealing who people truly are when circumstances become difficult. Some people mistake kindness for weakness. Others assume that quiet people have no strength simply because they do not constantly talk about their accomplishments. But character is not measured by volume. It is measured by integrity. Caroline's story reminds us that truth, preparation, and dignity often speak louder than anger ever could. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been underestimated and later proven stronger than people expected? Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need this reminder today. Thank you for watching.